December 1944. Budapest is burning. Along the frozen banks of the Danube River, bodies appear every morning, victims of the night's executions. The Jewish ghetto, surrounded by barbed wire, holds 60,000 people awaiting what everyone believes is inevitable death. In this frozen hell, an ordinary man is about to commit the most audacious act of theatre in World War II history. He is not Jewish, he is not Spanish, he is not a diplomat. But for 45 days, he will become the Spanish consul in Budapest. His real name is Giorgio Perlasca, an Italian trader who, just years earlier, had fought for Mussolini's fascist forces in the Spanish Civil War. A man who should have been on the other side of history. Instead, he will forge documents, lie to the Gestapo, confront Adolf Eichmann face to face, and threaten a government minister with international consequences for crimes not yet committed. He will save 5,218 lives. That's 4,000 more than Oskar Schindler. Yet his name remained unknown for 42 years. This is not a story about a saint. It's about a businessman who saw something he couldn't unsee, made a choice he couldn't unmake, and then spent the rest of his life pretending none of it ever happened. Because sometimes the most extraordinary acts of courage come from the most unexpected places. Sometimes a fascist becomes a saviour. Sometimes a lie becomes the only truth that matters. This is the story of Giorgio Perlasca, the man who became Jorge, the consul who never was, and the impostor who refused to let evil win without a fight. Giorgio Perlasca was born in Como, Italy, in January 1910. His was a world of order, tradition, and rising nationalist sentiment. Like so many young Italians in the 1920s, he was swept up in Mussolini's promises of restoring Italian greatness. He wasn't a monster. He was a believer. In 1935, Perlasca volunteered for Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia. He believed he was bringing civilization to Africa. A year later, he found himself in Spain, fighting for Francisco Franco's nationalist forces against the Republicans. He was a true believer in the fascist cause, convinced he was on the right side of history. But war has a way of revealing truths that propaganda obscures. In Spain, Perlasca witnessed what fascism actually meant when put into practice. He saw the violence, the cruelty, the casual brutality towards civilians. More importantly, he saw Franco's gratitude. At the war's end, Franco awarded Perlasca a safe conduct document, a diplomatic recognition for his service, a piece of paper that promised Spain would protect him should he ever need it. Perlasca kept that document. He had no idea it would later become the key to everything. When he returned to Italy in 1938, something inside him had changed. That same year, Mussolini announced the racial laws, adopting Hitler's anti-Semitic policies. Italy, which had never had such laws, suddenly declared its Jewish citizens inferior, stripped of rights, marked for persecution. Perlasca watched friends and business associates lose everything overnight. He watched good people become targets simply for existing. He couldn't reconcile this with the Italy he thought he was fighting for, so he made a quiet choice. He never joined the fascist party. He never wore the uniform again. He simply went back to work, trading meat for Italian companies across Eastern Europe. By 1943, Perlasca was in Budapest, Hungary, buying cattle for the Italian army. Just a businessman doing business. Then, on September 8, 1943, Italy surrendered to the Allies. Overnight, every Italian in German-controlled territory became an enemy of the Reich. Perlasca was trapped in Budapest. The Germans were hunting Italians who refused to join Mussolini's puppet government in the north. Prison camps were filling with Italian soldiers, diplomats, and civilians who chose loyalty to the king over loyalty to fascism. Perlasca was arrested and confined to a castle reserved for stateless diplomats, men and women caught between collapsing empires, waiting to see which side would claim them. He spent months there, watching, thinking, planning. That piece of paper from Spain was still in his pocket. After several months of confinement, Perlasca received a medical pass, allowing him limited movement within Budapest. He didn't waste the opportunity. He walked straight to the Spanish embassy. Spain was neutral in the war. Franco, despite his fascist sympathies, had kept Spain out of Hitler's Grand Alliance. This made Spanish diplomatic property a sanctuary, a small island of immunity in an ocean of occupation. Perlasca presented his old recognition certificate from the Spanish Civil War. He reminded the embassy staff of his service to Franco. He asked for asylum. The Spanish chargé d'affaires, a man named Angel Sans-Brie, looked at this Italian stranger and made a decision that would save thousands of lives. He issued Giorgio Perlasca a Spanish passport. Giorgio became Jorge, but Sans-Brie didn't just give him a new name, he gave him a mission. By late 1944, Hungary's situation had become catastrophic for its Jewish population. In March, Germany had occupied Hungary, paranoid that the Hungarians would switch sides as Italy had. Adolf Eichmann himself arrived in Budapest with a single purpose: to empty Hungary of Jews. 440,000 Hungarian Jews had already been deported to Auschwitz from the provinces. Only Budapest's Jews remained, roughly 200,000 people, and their time was running out. In October, the Arrow Cross Party, Hungary's fascist movement, seized power in a German-backed coup. Their leader, Ferenc Szalasi, was a fanatic whose hatred of Jews exceeded even that of many Nazis. The streets of Budapest became killing fields. Arrow Cross militias would pull Jews from their homes, march them to the Danube, shoot them, and watch their bodies fall into the frozen river. Witnesses reported the Danube running red. Children were shot in front of their parents. Parents were shot in front of their children. The only crime was being born Jewish. This was the world Jorge Perlasca walked into. Sans-Brie had already begun a rescue operation. He was exploiting a legal loophole in Spanish law. In 1924, Spain had passed a decree granting citizenship to Sephardic Jews, descendants of Jews expelled from Spain in the late 15th century. The law had been cancelled in 1930, but the Hungarian authorities didn't know that. Sans-Brie was issuing protection documents claiming Hungarian Jews were actually Spanish citizens awaiting repatriation. He was creating safe houses under Spanish diplomatic protection, buildings where Jews could shelter under the fiction of Spanish sovereignty. It was a beautiful lie, and it was working. Perlasca became Sans-Brie's right hand. He visited the safe houses, he distributed food, he negotiated with Hungarian officials. He learned how the system worked, how far he could push, where the boundaries were. He also met another man doing similar work, Raoul Wallenberg, the Swedish diplomat who would become famous for his rescue efforts. They coordinated operations, shared intelligence, protected each other's safe houses. For a few months, this fragile network held. Thousands of Jews lived under the protection of neutral countries, protected by pieces of paper and diplomatic conventions that everyone knew were fictions, but that no one was quite ready to completely ignore. Then, in late November 1944, everything changed. The Soviet Red Army was closing in on Budapest. The city was about to become a battlefield. Sans-Brie received orders from Madrid to evacuate immediately. He left without telling Perlasca. One morning, the Spanish embassy was simply empty. The ambassador was gone. The staff was gone. Only Perlasca remained, along with a handful of Hungarian secretaries who had been helping with the rescue operation. The Hungarian government immediately sent word. The Spanish embassy was closed. The safe houses were no longer protected. All Jews sheltering under Spanish protection had 48 hours to report to the ghetto. It was a death sentence for over 5,000 people. Giorgio Perlasca stood in the empty embassy and made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He would not leave. He would not let them die. He would become the Spanish consul. Perlasca moved quickly. He couldn't let the Hungarian authorities realise the Spanish ambassador was actually gone. He needed to buy time, create an illusion, make them believe the embassy was still functioning. He drafted a letter on official Spanish embassy letterhead. It announced that Angel Sans-Brie had been temporarily called away on urgent diplomatic business, but would return shortly. In the meantime, the letter stated Jorge Perlasca had been appointed as interim chargé d'affaires, authorised to conduct all embassy business in Sans-Brie's absence. He forged the ambassador's signature. Then he delivered the letter to the Hungarian Foreign Ministry himself, dressed in his finest suit, speaking perfect Spanish with the confidence of a man who had every right to be there. The Hungarians accepted it. They had no reason not to. Why would anyone volunteer to stay in a city about to become a war zone? Why would anyone lie about being a diplomat in Nazi-occupied Hungary, where one mistake meant torture and execution? It was such an audacious lie that it never occurred to them it might be true. For the next 45 days, from December 1st, 1944 to January 16th, 1945, Giorgio Perlasca ran the Spanish embassy in Budapest, alone, without authorization, without support, without backup. He was neither Spanish nor a diplomat. He was an Italian meat trader playing the most dangerous role of his life. And he was magnificent. Perlasca's strategy was simple but brilliant. He behaved exactly as a Spanish diplomat should behave, arrogant, demanding, confident in his diplomatic immunity, and completely unwilling to tolerate Hungarian interference in Spanish affairs. When Arrow Cross soldiers tried to raid the Spanish safe houses, he would appear personally, shouting in Spanish, waving diplomatic credentials, threatening international incidents. He would stand in doorways, blocking entrance, daring them to violate Spanish sovereignty. Most of the time, they backed down. Armed fascist militias, drunk on power and violence, would retreat from a man with nothing but a forged letter and absolute conviction. But paperwork alone wouldn't save lives. The Jews in the safe houses needed food. They needed medicine. They needed hope. Perlasca created an entire fake Spanish community. He issued thousands of protection letters, far more than Spain had ever authorized. He exploited that old law about Sephardic Jews, claiming that anyone with even the most distant Spanish ancestry was eligible for protection. The Hungarian authorities were confused by the numbers. They questioned why Spain seemed to be protecting so many Jews. Perlasca had an answer ready. These weren't just any Jews, they were Spanish citizens, and Spain took care of its own. To harm them would be to insult Spain, and did Hungary really want to risk angering Franco's government? It was absurd. Spain hadn't authorised any of this. Franco's government was barely aware Budapest even had Jews, but the Hungarians didn't know that. They saw official documents, heard confident claims, and hesitated. That hesitation saved lives. Perlasca's most dangerous encounter came at the railway station. The Arrow Cross was loading Jews into cattle cars for deportation to concentration camps. Among them were dozens of people holding Spanish protection letters. Perlasca arrived at the Chuy-Sorn station and confronted the German SS officer in charge. He demanded the immediate release of all Spanish citizens. The officer refused. According to Perlasca's later account, he and Raoul Wallenberg were both at the station that day. Wallenberg later told him the SS officer he had challenged was Adolf Eichmann himself, the architect of the Holocaust, the man personally responsible for the murder of millions. We don't know if this is true, but we know Perlasca stood his ground. He argued, threatened, insisted. Finally, he was allowed to compile a list of names and take those people away. He didn't just take the people on his list. He called out dozens of additional names, people he'd never met, adding them on the spot. The guards were confused but didn't stop him. He loaded more people onto his truck than he was authorised to take and drove them back to safety. Every person on that truck was saved by a lie, told with absolute conviction. By early January 1945, Budapest was collapsing. Soviet artillery pounded the city day and night. The Danube bridges were destroyed. Food was running out. The Arrow Cross, knowing their end was near, became even more desperate and violent. They made a final decision. They would liquidate the Budapest ghetto entirely. 60,000 Jews, all at once. The same thing the Germans had done to the Warsaw ghetto 2 years earlier. Perlasca learned of the plan from his network of contacts. He knew he had to act, but this was beyond forged letters and diplomatic theatre. This required something more. He requested a meeting with Gábor Vajna, Hungary's interior minister, one of the most powerful men in the Arrow-Cross government, a true believer in the cause, a man personally responsible for thousands of deaths. Perlasca walked into that office as Jorge, the Spanish consul. He brought with him Raoul Wallenberg and Karl Lutz, the Swiss consul. 3 neutral diplomats representing 3 neutral countries. They delivered an ultimatum. Perlasca spoke with absolute authority. He informed Vajna that Spain was protecting 3,000 Hungarian Jews who were now Spanish citizens. If any harm came to them or to any Jews in the Budapest ghetto, there would be consequences. The Allies were winning the war. Everyone in that room knew it. When the war ended, Perlasca said, there would be trials, there would be justice, and Spain would ensure that anyone who harmed Spanish citizens would be held accountable. He was bluffing. Spain had no such policy. Franco's government had barely acknowledged the rescue operations. But Vajna didn't know that. More importantly, the Soviets were literally at the gates. The Arrow-Cross government had days, maybe hours, left in power. Vajna knew what was coming. He'd seen what happened to Nazi collaborators when the Red Army arrived. The threat worked. The plan to destroy the ghetto was cancelled. 60,000 people were saved by 3 men with briefcases and an extraordinary amount of nerve. But Perlasca's work wasn't over. The safe houses were running out of food. People were starving. The city was a war zone. Supply lines had collapsed. Perlasca left the relative safety of the embassy every day, moving through streets under bombardment, negotiating with whoever had food to sell, using Spanish embassy funds, his own money, anything he could find to keep people alive. On one of these trips, he witnessed an Arrow-Cross patrol dragging Jewish children from a safe house. He ran toward them, shouting in Spanish, waving his diplomatic papers. The patrol commander raised his weapon. Perlasca didn't stop. He walked straight up to the commander and demanded the children be released. They were Spanish citizens, he said. Their removal was a violation of international law. The commander hesitated. In that moment of hesitation, Perlasca grabbed 2 of the children and started walking away. The patrol didn't shoot. They let him go. Those 2 children were 5 and 7 years old. They survived the war. On January 16, 1945, Soviet forces entered the part of Budapest where the Spanish embassy stood. The siege was over. The safe houses were liberated. The Jews under Spanish protection were free. Giorgio Perlasca's performance was over. The Soviet officers who arrived at the embassy were confused. They asked Perlasca for his credentials. He showed them his forged documents. They asked questions he couldn't answer. His Spanish identity was crumbling, and suddenly, it didn't matter anymore. The Soviets arrested him, along with everyone else at the embassy. They held him for questioning for several days. Eventually, they realised he wasn't important enough to keep. They released him and told him to leave Hungary. Perlasca made his way to Turkey, then slowly back to Italy, arriving home in August 1945. The war in Europe had been over for 3 months. Italy was in ruins, struggling to rebuild, coming to terms with its fascist past. Perlasca went back to his family. He got a job. He lived in Padua, a quiet city in northern Italy. He became a pensioner, a grandfather, an ordinary man, and he never told anyone what he had done. Not his wife, not his children, not his friends. For 42 years, Giorgio Perlasca lived as if Budapest had never happened, as if Jorge had never existed. He drafted a detailed report of his activities in October 1945 and sent copies to the Spanish government and the Italian government. He received a polite acknowledgement from Spain and nothing from Italy. Then silence. The world moved on. The Nuremberg trials focused on major war criminals. The stories that got told were about soldiers and generals about concentration camps and liberation, about obvious villains and clear heroes. There was no room in that narrative for a former fascist who became an impostor diplomat and saved thousands through bureaucratic theatre and sheer audacity. It was too complicated, too strange, too small. Perlasca kept a copy of his report in a drawer. Sometimes at night he would take it out and read it, remembering the faces of the children he saved, remembering the fear in the eyes of people in the safe houses, remembering standing in front of that Arrow Cross commander, certain he was about to die. But he told no one. In 1980, Perlasca had a stroke. For a brief moment, facing mortality, he told his closest family members about Budapest, about Jorge, about the embassy. They thought he was confused. The stroke, they assumed, had affected his memory. Their father, the quiet meat trader, claiming he'd been a Spanish diplomat, saving Jews from Nazis. It seemed like a fantasy. Then, in 1987, something extraordinary happened. A group of Hungarian Jewish survivors held a reunion in Berlin. They were comparing stories, sharing memories, trying to piece together the fragmented history of their survival. Many had been saved by diplomatic protection, hidden in safe houses run by neutral countries. Someone mentioned the Spanish embassy. Someone else remembered the consul's name, Jorge Perlasca. They decided to find him, to thank him, to tell him that the children he saved had grown up, had families of their own, had lived full lives because of what he did. They searched in Spain. The Spanish government had no record of a diplomat named Jorge Perlasca serving in Budapest. They checked diplomatic archives, wartime records, post-war registrations. Nothing. Then someone remembered. He wasn't Spanish. He was Italian. His real name was Giorgio. They found him in Padua, a 77-year-old retired businessman, living quietly with his family. When the survivors appeared at his door, Perlasca was stunned. He had assumed for 42 years that no one remembered, that it didn't matter, that he had been a footnote in a story too big to care about individual acts. Instead, they told him he was a hero. They brought photographs of their families, children and grandchildren, who existed because he had stood in a doorway and refused to move. They brought documents, the protection letters he had issued, yellowed and creased from being carried for decades. They had kept them. All these years, they had kept his lies, his forgeries, his audacious theatre, as proof that someone had cared enough to risk everything. The story broke in Italian media, then international media. Survivors came forward with more testimonies. Historians started investigating. The details checked out. The documents were real. The safe houses were documented. The 5,218 lives were accounted for. In 1989, Israel recognized Giorgio Perlasca as righteous among the nations, the highest honor given to non-Jews who saved Jewish lives during the Holocaust. He traveled to Jerusalem for the ceremony. In 1990, the United States Holocaust Memorial Council awarded him their first Medal of Remembrance. Hungary honored him. Spain honored him. Italy finally honored him. Perlasca accepted these honors with grace and visible discomfort. When journalists asked him why he had done it, why he had risked his life for strangers, he gave the simplest answer imaginable. He said he couldn't stand watching people being killed like animals. He couldn't stand seeing children murdered. So he did what he had to do. When asked why he never spoke about it, he simply said he saw no reason to. It wasn't about him. It was about them, the people he saved. They were the story, not him. Giorgio Perlasca died on August 15, 1992 in Padua, at the age of 82. Thousands attended his funeral. Survivors came from around the world to say goodbye to the man who gave them life. In 2002, Italian journalist Enrico Dealio published a book about Perlasca called The Banality of Goodness, deliberately echoing Hannah Arendt's famous phrase about the banality of evil. If evil could be ordinary, bureaucratic, committed by average people following orders, then perhaps goodness could be equally ordinary, equally possible for anyone. Giorgio Perlasca wasn't a saint, he had been a fascist. He had believed in ideologies we now rightly condemn. He had made terrible choices earlier in his life. But when he saw evil, when he witnessed the machinery of genocide up close, he made a different choice. He didn't start a revolution. He didn't lead an army. He simply refused to be a bystander. He picked up a pen, forged some documents, and played a role. For 45 days in the winter of 1944, Giorgio Perlasca was the Spanish consul in Budapest. He was Jorge, the man who wouldn't leave, who wouldn't be silent, who wouldn't let them die without someone standing in the way. 5,218 people lived because an Italian meat trader decided that some lies are more true than truth, that some roles are worth playing even when the audience might shoot you for a bad performance. History remembers Oskar Schindler because Steven Spielberg made a movie about him. But Perlasca saved 4,000 more lives, and most people have never heard his name. Perhaps that's exactly how he wanted it. Not a hero. Just a man who saw something unbearable and refused to look away. The Spanish embassy in Budapest still stands. There's a plaque now, commemorating what happened there. It mentions Angel Sans-Brise, the real diplomat who started the rescue operation. And it mentions Jorge Perlasca, the consul who never was, the impostor who became real through sheer force of will and an unshakable belief that some things matter more than your own survival. In his final interviews before his death, Perlasca said something that perhaps explains everything. He said he wasn't brave. He said he was simply in a position to do something, and doing nothing would have been unbearable. That's the most terrifying part of his story. Not that one man could save thousands, but that it was possible at all. That lies could defeat genocide. That paperwork could stop bullets. That conviction could overpower violence. It means the Holocaust wasn't inevitable. It means that everywhere there were victims, there could have been Giorgio Perlascas, ordinary people making the choice to act, to lie, to risk, to stand in the doorway and refuse to move. There weren't enough of them. There never are. But there was one in Budapest in 1944, and 5,218 people lived, had children, had grandchildren, built lives, told stories, laughed, cried, loved and died of old age instead of bullets and gas chambers. Because one man decided to become someone he wasn't, to save people he'd never met, for no reason other than it was the only thing he could live with. That's not the banality of goodness. That's the extraordinary power of the ordinary choice. The decision made in a moment that echoes across generations. Giorgio Perlasca was a fascist who became a hero, an Italian who became Spanish, a businessman who became a diplomat, a liar who told the only truth that mattered. He was proof that redemption is possible, that past mistakes don't define future choices, that you can be on the wrong side of history and still, in one moment of clarity, choose to be on the right side of humanity. And perhaps that's the real reason he never talked about it, because he knew the most important thing wasn't what he did. It was that anyone could have done it. That's the unbearable truth at the heart of his story. The courage wasn't extraordinary, the opportunity was. And most people, when given the opportunity, chose silence, chose safety, chose survival. Giorgio Perlasca chose differently, and 5,218 times that choice meant the difference between life and death.